Well, welcome to the AADA and AMCD practice brief. I am Dr. Jillian Bluford. I'm one of the task force members, and today I am joined with Dr. Marlon Johnson, Assistant Professor of Seminary of the Southwest. Super thrilled to have you.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here and glad to be a part of this good work.
Great. So this is brief, and so I want to jump right in. So I'll start with our first question, which is describe the value of multiculturalism in the work that you do.
Absolutely. So, as you kind of noted in your introduction, I work for a um, religious institution, so an institution of where our primary goal is to train priests and to prepare them for their work out into the church. But I also specifically function under a counseling program and a clinical mental health program nested within that context. So a lot of times when I'm talking to potential students or with colleagues in the field about what does it mean to engage in clinical training and counselor training within a particular context, I often remind them or highlight and emphasize that we identify as a spiritually integrated counseling space.
Mm.
And what that means is that we're not functioning specifically through you have to see the world from this ideological standpoint, or that we are going to center a particular practice that we hope that you integrate. But when we talk about spirituality as a cultural lens, it opens up and broadens this idea of how do people construct this experience of life and of spirit and of body um, through a particular lens, a spiritual lens, and that gives us opportunities to then move out from there to talk about culture and our cultural values, our cultural narratives, and how that impacts our wellness and our healthcare and our mental health care. And so for me, multiculturalism within the educator space gives me an opportunity to not just look at who I am and who you are and see how there are similarities and differences, but it also helps me to really construct a sense of self and how those different selves interact with other people, and how hopefully self as counselor and the cultural perspectives that I hold and my ability to be empathic and engage with the cultural other helps me to then bridge the gap and to create a healing and therapeutic environment.
Mm.
And that's what how multiculturalism kind of impacts my work, especially as educator, and then a little bit as counselor. But I'll hold off and talk about that.
Yeah. Yeah. So it seems like you want to imagine someone, as their whole self, and that can include their, like, how does spirituality play like a key role in just their day to day, their values, their beliefs, how they make meaning, and like how do I figure that out about someone else to then foster the relationships between with me as the educator or the counselor, but then to other people. Like, how do I
Absolutely.
foster those connections?
Absolutely. That's perfect.
Yeah. So then what role does social justice play into your
Hmm.
work in fostering those connections? And like you mentioned before, like not pinpointing like you need to follow one belief or have one perspective, but rather like advocating like for everyone.
Yeah. So it's really nice to think about culture and justice um, kind of in a parallel process with one another. Because as I teach students and engage in this conversation around um, clinical work and counseling and comfort of counseling, a lot of times I start by talking about the unusual situation of me being a young Black male from the rural South, now being a counselor educator,
Mm.
and um, what acts of justice had to happen prior to me even going to undergrad, honestly. Um, to even get to be in the front of the classroom.
Mm.
And so when I think about engaging in social justice, I'm always inviting in the conversation and asking those questions about who's not being heard, what voices are not present inside of this space, what perspective is missing, and what may have been preventing those voices from being placed inside of this conversation. Now, what is our responsibility to either invite those voices or to create an environment where those voices not only feel welcome, but feel valued and are valued. Not only feel valued, but actually genuinely are valued.
Right.
And so I
Yeah.
try to do that in the classroom space, but also in faculty meetings
Mm.
and administrative meetings and leadership
Yeah.
opportunities, all those spaces. All that is, to me, facets of justice.
Yeah. So not just like acknowledging like who isn't at the table, but then like inviting them and not only like making them feel valued and welcome, but like actually believing that and like creating the space for everyone to like have that seat at the table and
Mhm.
um, not feel like tokenized or not feel like, oh, like I'm just here because they like, I'm serving one purpose of like being that diverse person here, but it's like, no, we want to hear your voices and amplify your voices.
Absolutely. I think too often we um, do that diversity marker, the tokenization of, okay, now we have someone who identifies within this racial and ethnic category, or,
Mm-hmm.
oh yeah, now we have someone from the LGBTQ community, and like, now we've done it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not justice,
Yeah.
right? Justice is deeply assessing the systems that
Mm-hmm.
prevented people from being in that space in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Like what it's not so much of like kudos to us for like inviting like folks from different populations, but it's like what stopped them from just joining the table in the first place and joining the conversation and like breaking down those barriers.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. So then moving on to the next question of like how do you incorporate like the lifespan development in your work? And like I think about like the facets of like multiculturalism and social justice and how it can look so different depending on where someone is in their life.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the courses that I've been fortunate to teach have um, centered around assessment and testing.
Mm.
They've centered around career and lifestyle development, and then group theories and group counseling and skills and helping relationships. So those have kind of been like my four core areas of work so far. And when I start thinking about how I um, engage my students who are then going to engage clients,
Mm.
it's important for me to remind myself and to remind them how each topic area isn't just happening to at a particular stage, right? Like when I talk about career, I'm not just talking about students who are or clients who might be between the ages of like 16 and 35, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm talking to my students about what lifestyle considerations, what lifespan considerations do we need to think about with 5 to 10-year-olds when we talk about career development? What might be happening with parents and adults and even grandparents and their narrative around career and the world of work that is then impacting this young one, right? Like, so
Mm-hmm.
when I think about um, development and lifespan development, it's that all of these narratives, though we might share some cultural identities, based on where we are in life and what experiences we've had at those different developmental stages, that's going to deeply shape how we then engage with that topic, whether it's our understanding of career, whether it's the development of a social identity, whether it's, I don't know, even our ability to create a therapeutic relationship with our counselor when we are
Mm-hmm.
encountering psychological hardships.
Right.
Yeah, lifespan just seems so deeply foundational to all of the core areas of counseling.
Yeah. So it seems like you try to really hone into your students that it's not just like pick a topic and then just focus on like one area of like lifespan development, but rather how does it like come through and impact throughout the entire lifespan, whether it's career, like you mentioned, or relationships, or grief and loss. Like, how does that come up throughout like any age?
Yeah.
But
Yes.
like will look a little different, and therefore, like your therapeutic approach
Mhm.
may have to look a little different.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. So the more we can think on different levels of lifespan experiences, but also like recognizing that lifespan development is, from my perspective, in my opinion, has systemic ramifications. And what I
Mm,
mean by that is it's family systems, it's
mm-hmm,
sociopolitical systems, it's environmental experiences, all of those things.
mm-hmm.
Um, when my students can start to wrap their brains around that, I think lifespan development becomes that much more important to their clinical work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So our final question is kind of, tying in everything we just talked about, and what you like, what are some like concrete examples of how you have incorporated multiculturalism, social justice, like across the lifespan development? And this can be, in your role as a counselor, as an educator, supervisor, researcher, all the many hats that you that you hold.
Yeah. So I'll talk about three of those four roles you just mentioned. The first one being as an educator. I think I've pretty much talked about that throughout this brief conversation. And as an educator, it feels important to me to trouble a case study and to help the students to match up a typical experience with an atypical perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So, an example would be when I'm trying to teach a particular career theory, and I might talk about something like job transition, which is pretty common with the millennial generation. But I might say, now let's consider job transition at 65 rather than someone who might want to retire at 65, right? There
Mm-hmm.
might be, there's kind of like a construction that at a particular age, you're supposed to do a particular thing with your career.
Mm-hmm.
And so I might trouble my students to think in those terms, or to even say, when I say job transition, what about a 16-year-old? How are we going to talk about job transition then as they're transitioning from being a secondary student to post-secondary?
Right.
And that's just going to really pull them into new conversations, or even saying like, okay, so how does that then look differently for a Black student, a student from a Latinx background? How does that look different from a student in a rural context versus a urban or suburban context? All of those thoughts, just to really get them going. Um, as a counselor, it feels important to um, assess and develop my own comfort around broaching and my broaching behaviors and my broaching attitudes. So I think about the term broaching as it was developed through Dr. Norma Day Vines and her wonderful amount of work there. So for me, it looks like taking the broaching attitudes and behavior survey and trying to figure out where exactly I am there, my level of comfort with talking about different cultural narratives, cultural experiences, and then taking active steps to either consult with a colleague or to engage with a supervisor about what is necessary, what is needed
Mm-hmm.
to or what even is the barrier for becoming more comfortable with
Right.
talking about someone who has an outsider perspective of a particular culture for me. And then as a researcher, it's so powerful to start reading literature that um, centers development and lifespan experiences outside of the counseling literature.
Mm-hmm.
One powerful thing that I did that I didn't realize was going to impact my experience as a researcher was I read a book with my 9-year-old niece. And this book was about growing up as a young Black woman in Portland, Oregon.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it was fiction. It was very lighthearted. There were some darker themes to it, but it gave me an opportunity to really conceptualize what have I been missing in the
Mm-hmm.
constructed narrative of Black women in America. So then it led me down a pipeline to look through some sociology literature, some blogs, and in that way, to think about what it's like growing up Black outside of the South, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that has then expanded my ability to understand the development of Black identity in America. So, yeah, as a researcher, getting outside of your literature base to
Mm-hmm.
better understand experience, to better understand development, I think is just going to make your research more rich.
Right. All wonderful examples. And so I just wanted to thank you again, Dr. Johnson, for chatting with me and sharing just your work and your passion and really just the great things that you're doing. So I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Bluford.
Yeah.